everyone doing? We made it to the end. We're ready to win our iPad. All right. Well, appreciate you all sticking around. Huge thank you to Ken and the InfraDay team and all the sponsors that pulled this together, and especially you all who stuck here on 520. I know everyone at this point is probably hearing the mountains calling them now. So we'll get right into it. Our discussion today is going to focus on climate resilient infrastructure. And what's cool about this is I'm not a Colorado native, even though I do live here now. And I learned so much about how regionally our climate changes. I never knew about water rights until I got to Colorado living in New Jersey. We have, I guess, plenty of water there. It's not, say it's not the cleanest river in the world, but we got water, I guess. And so when I came here, there was a huge culture shock. I wasn't aware of forest fires being a massive problem or water needing to be conserved as much as it nearly needed to. And this moving target is something that's really interesting to think about how we focus, one, on a federal level, but then how do we look at it regionally and locally, knowing that there is so much nuance and difference. And so very excited to have this panel discussion today and dig into that topic. We're going to look into a little bit of that high level and how it differs from that federal down to that local level, what we're doing a little bit today in order to get in front of the curve and where we think things are moving into the future. And so with that, I'd like to kick off into introductions. And Emily, if you'd like to take us off.
Sure. Thanks, Nick. I'm Emily Bertram. I work for EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, so I'm the federal government rep on this panel. I'm in the Denver office, EPA Region 8, and I am the climate change coordinator, and I'm also, more recently, I've gotten involved in managing a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act funding that's coming through EPA for mostly climate-related projects, but a lot of other good stuff too.
Hey guys, happy afternoon. My name is Dana Hoffman. Really glad that this conference is happening. I work for the City of Denver, the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, and my role is as our transportation climate specialist. So making sure that we're thinking strategically about mitigation and adaptation in our projects and programs as an agency.
Hi, I'm Austin Krochmark, and I'm from Denver Water. I'm our water efficiency lead. So you can think of that as kind of traditional conservation programming, and also as we move into our new role of helping change landscapes. One thing to mention for the audience, if you're not from the Denver area, we are not directly tied to the city and county of Denver. They're our main customer, but they only represent about half of our population served. So we serve just as many people outside the city and county as inside the city and county. And so we're always looking for those new partnerships on how we can kind of expand our messaging outside of just city and county of Denver, but across the whole metro region.
Hey everyone, I'm Jessica Anderson, Urban Ecology Supervisor with Denver Parks and Recreation. My team's role is really to make our park system and our park-like spaces, our infrastructure, our green infrastructure, make all of that more climate resilient. So my passion really is in connecting people to nature throughout our urban environment.
Awesome, thank you. And so I think what's really fascinating for this for me, as I was an architect by trade, I moved into technology, and getting to see how information is now being exchanged so we can actually look at these impacts that we're making. But what I'm most curious, I think, is learning a little bit more about, where are the federal initiatives at, how is the funding being supported, and what does that look like when it starts to get down to the regional and local level. I'm going to let you, from the EPA, start to work our way down from the top.
Sure. So as all of you probably know, EPA's role in climate has fluctuated over the years. I've been with EPA 15 years now, so I've gone through several different administrations where we've done a lot of work on climate, and then we haven't done as much, and now we're back to doing a lot of work in the climate space. But I think pretty consistently we've always kind of kept track of the impacts across. We've been part of sort of global initiatives to identify impacts and solutions, but also down to the local level. So tracking impacts and both past and then projected impacts is something that we've been part of. But I think the unique opportunity right now is all this influx of funding, which other panels have already talked about. So I probably don't need to like go into a lot of detail. And actually, the panel just before this actually gave a nice introduction to one of the programs that I'm pretty involved in here in the Denver office for EPA, which is the climate pollution reduction grants, which are under the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm actually the project officer on Colorado Energy Office's $3 million grant to update the roadmap. So I think a lot of EPA's traditional work has been regulatory in nature and looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But I think the other piece of it is the resiliency piece and the adaptation piece. And there was an executive order early on in this administration for all federal agencies to develop adaptation plans. So you can find them online. Each federal agency has its own plan that basically describes how that agency is going to address resiliency in its core program. So EPA has one, and then of course, EPA had to be the go-getter that it is, and is then asked all the regional offices and all the national program offices to develop our own. So Region 8 actually has its own resiliency plan, and a lot of that goes into, we have this core work that we, need to do because of the statutes and all that. So how do we start to integrate resiliency into those programs? And then also with all this money, how do we make sure that the infrastructure that we're funding, for example, or the other projects that we're funding, takes into account what our climate, that our climate is changing and what it'll look like in the future.
And so when we look at Region 8, I guess, against the federal goals even, do you see there being similarities and differences across the different region approaches?
There's definitely differences across the regions. I think, I'm also not native to Colorado, so I lived for, 20 plus years in Philadelphia. I worked in that regional office for EPA in Philadelphia, and, the climate impacts there are vastly different than they are out here, and the players are a lot different. So, what I'm really excited about is, there's a lot of, effort to include our, for example, rural communities, which there are a lot of in our region 8. How we're divided out is 6 different states. So we have states like Wyoming, the Dakotas, and so there's a lot of rural communities. There's a lot of tribal governments, and so I think we come to the table. Our regional office, trying to represent our states and our communities and our tribes. Other states have different issues, if you're coastline or that kind of thing. So there are a lot of differences in approaches as well. So, yeah.
So as we zoom in, and I see a lot of nodding going on, I don't know if Dana, you want to jump in and start to talk a little bit about, more of what we're doing here specifically, closer to Colorado and Denver.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely as a regional issue. And then, of course, Denver has its own issues, right, that are specific to our needs here in this part of the region. And if you've been in Denver, even in the last couple days, you probably have experienced some of our biggest sort of risks from climate, high heat, air quality, and to some extent, more extreme storms. In this case, we're seeing a lot of rain, right? But more extreme storms across the board, and that would be snowstorms, wind, and rain. So a lot of what we're thinking about now is doubling down on adaptation. Like Denver, like the EPA, and a lot of places have been focusing on mitigation, and we're continuing to do that. But how can we really focus in on those specific impacts of climate and make moves in that direction? So we're privileged on the influx of money front, both from the federal government and things like IRA, but also that Denver voters in 2019, I believe, voted for their own sales tax, which gives us about $40 million a year, contributing to a climate protection fund. And my own salary comes directly from that fund. So yeah, it's really focusing in on those things. One of the things we're looking at is really updating our climate adaptation plan to basically build a heat plan. We've already done that to some extent within my department when we're looking at where to improve our transit stops by basically mapping high heat roadways and deciding where to prioritize having trees there or having shelters there. So things like that, but across the board for all of our infrastructure. How can we change and use our right of way, the thing we have the most control over, to provide those safe spaces, knowing the impacts that are coming our way?
That's really interesting to think about, and I know we talked a little bit about mobility, and I want to get to that too, but when you mentioned the rainy season, that was something when I moved to Colorado for the past 7 years, it's been pretty dry, and then last June we outrained Seattle, which I'm still trying to figure out what that even means for us. And so, going over to you, Austin, looking at Denver water and how the water situation does ebb and flow. How are we looking at being resilient into the future when we have so much uncertainty?
Yeah, that's a great segue, and I'll try to tie a couple of these themes together. So, Denver Water worked regionally with Southern Nevada Water Authority and Metropolitan Water, which is most of Southern California, last August to sign a memorandum of understanding among Colorado River Basin municipal providers and users. And our commitment in that was really a recommitment to conservation, first and foremost. And then, second, was a commitment to removing non functional turf. So this isn't like a full all-out war on turf, but it's really identifying those places where turf grass just doesn't really make sense. So if it's a narrow right-of-way area, what can we put there that still maintains the health of trees, which are so vitally important in this climate, especially as it warms? And then what are other areas that we can kind of identify? And I think Jessica will jump into that a little bit more. And then the third one was really kind of making our reuse programs more robust. So here in city and county, we're very fortunate that it was one of the first to pass gray water regulation. So allowing for retreatment and using that for toilet flushing or subsurface irrigation. And then Denver City and County also led a One Water plan, which really looks at the urban water cycle in a holistic approach. And the thought on that is water providers are kind of regional. They don't all do potable water, wastewater, stormwater. So we need to get all of those individuals and experts together and make sure that we're responding to these challenges in a holistic manner. And I think that that framework has really done a great job of breaking down kind of interagency silos around here. But specifically for Denver Water, as we move more into this incentivizing landscape change, we're really just trying to work with our local communities, all 18 local governments we serve, to look for those great projects and then take any chance we can to kind of help our project partners out by making sure they're maximizing getting the work done when they have the opportunities to do that.
And I think you did tee Jessica up great. So if we want to, before we jump into the projects probably that you're collaborating on, just start off at like the high level where Parks is at, and then we can connect the dots there.
Yeah, so in Parks and Rec, and specifically the urban ecology focus, is tying together many different departments at the city, not just within parks. So I mentioned our park-like spaces. We're working with our transportation division and our wastewater division, our green infrastructure division, and our climate action sustainability resiliency division as well to look at the city holistically and with not just in the boundaries of those park spaces. So thinking about how parks and park-like spaces are infrastructure, how our ecosystems and our habitat is infrastructure, and how our trees are infrastructure. So one of the big projects this year we're kicking off is an urban forest strategic plan. So thinking about how trees relate to all of the impacts Dana alluded to of heat and air pollution and stormwater. We're also working on water conservation. So as Austin alluded to, thinking about how we as a park system can reduce some of our non-functional turf spaces. So as a park system, we always will have those recreational athletic fields, those spaces that need to stay bluegrass turf that we need to keep watering. But there's a lot of spaces in the parks that are not functional, are not those active recreation. So we're looking at ways to implement and redesign our parks and design our new parks in a new way to look at bluegrass turf is not the default option. So Denver Parks internally has just passed our policy that our parks planning division will implement, that bluegrass turf is not the default. We will not design new park spaces just filling in everything with bluegrass. We will be looking at an ecosystem services perspective and only putting in turf grass on those active recreation spaces, our athletic fields, our playgrounds, those places where people really need to be. So we're looking at flipping our parks from the traditional City Beautiful movement like Washington Park and Cheeseman Park that are bluegrass with trees and they look beautiful, but that does not look like Colorado. So we're trying to flip that perspective to be around 75% of our park space will be native landscapes that look true to Colorado, that you will know Denver is in this landscape and these parks are of this place, not just a park that could be anywhere, that could be in Philadelphia. So we're really trying to look at this holistically of how do parks fill that niche of green infrastructure.
I really like that too about capturing the spirit of Colorado and looking beyond the bluegrass solution that you can find pretty much everywhere. I find that you know in today's day and age we're slowly becoming homogenized. You can get sushi in Colorado, and that sometimes just seems weird to me. But to be able to really celebrate the locality in a way that's thoughtful and respectful to the environment, I think has a lot of positive effects. And are you seeing some of those?
Absolutely. A lot of people are really starting to embrace that native landscape. Some of our newer neighborhoods, the Central Park neighborhood in Northfield area, those those neighborhoods are being built and redeveloped around that nature and connection to nature. So connecting our people via trails to those open spaces like the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge, and making sure people just embrace that spirit of what Colorado is and connecting people to nature.
And I think one thing that built on that too, especially being that non-native coming here and seeing people bike from Boulder to Denver, which is still unfathomable to me, but we do it, and it's beautiful out here. So I understand why. And I know we were talking about mobility a bit on the prep call, and I'm curious. We um, learn in architecture, we learn how good design promotes good behavior, and so if you hide an elevator you can get people to walk upstairs, and it's really fascinating stuff. And so I'm curious, as we've started to explore the parks and the connectivity, how are we seeing increased utilization and people getting outside and maybe changing the way they travel?
Yeah, so Denver Parks and Rec manages 100 miles of trails within our city. So that's not even counting the on street bike system, that's just our off street trail system. We have started installing trail counters. So periodically on all our regional trails, we have data of which direction people are going and where they're going. So we can make these connections of what are the missing links in our city? How should our trail system evolve? We're starting to see that data and really change our system based on that. Um,
Awesome. Well, that's so I'm working my way back here. I'm curious how that ties into the water solution too.
It actually ties in pretty well. So Denver Water has operated the Highline Canal for up until very recently, and that was I think 76 miles through the metro area. And the canal itself just leaks like a sieve. So we decided probably about a decade ago that this doesn't really make a lot of sense to operate for the handful of irrigators that still run off the canal. We need to find new connections for them. And in the long run, that's better off for us because we're not just wasting that water. But now it's a very active recreation corridor, and it's used by a lot more cyclists and ultra marathoners that are training and just doing insane runs, in my opinion. Um, but it's also now, since we're not using it to convey water, it has become this huge stormwater asset as well. So it's a place that we can take some of our stormwater and stormwater overflows and direct it in those extreme rain events and just let it kind of percolate out and then go into the ground. So we do have a small role in mobility, but not quite in the same way.
Well, it's because what's always interesting is just how we change one thing and then we impact another, and I think that's kind of the complexity of climate is every time we try to prepare, Mother Nature is going to change her mind. And what's going back to mobility and talking about water, I always like to kind of look at roads as kind of the human river of sorts, because it is how we move things from point A to point B. We started doing it with rivers actually in the first place with lumber, and so it's this new kind of it's the people river of sorts. And so I'm curious then too, as we get back to talking about the shade on streets, what are some of those impacts about rethinking our street fronts and our streetscapes that we're seeing that can help improve resiliency and climate effects?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in one, but I wish we had rivers we could navigate here like you do out on the East Coast. Yeah, so I guess for the last 5 years or so, our department has been focused on getting high quality and higher comfort bike facilities and pedestrian facilities out there as quickly as possible, what we call like quick build. And that's using basically paint and what we call candlesticks or bollards, basically a plastic stick in the road that you've seen downtown. And the intent of that was to provide that new infrastructure as quickly as possible. So our last mayor had a goal of 125 new miles of bike lanes in 5 years. We did accomplish that. So we have a little over 130 that were put in over the last 5 years. And I think that mobility itself is an adaptation tool, right? Providing mobility options and flexibility is going to be really important to us, allowing ourselves to adapt to a new environment. But what's getting really exciting now, especially with big chunks of money coming our way, is combining some of these things like the greenways and our riverways with more of our getting people around. So obviously we've had the Cherry Creek bike path. It's, our crown jewel, our OG. Highline is fantastic either. And I think both of those really started bike culture in the Denver region. We now have some additional contributions that are shorter because it is incredibly costly to do these type of things. But like the 39th Avenue Greenway, which is both a way that we carry water, clean that stormwater out, provide new native plantings, and it's an incredible, like very lovely path to walk on and bike on. And that's the next challenge, is how do we provide these spaces that do all of the above? How do they carry water? How do they provide greenery? How do they reflect better so we're not contributing to urban heat island? And how are we carrying people on our roadways, which are rivers of carrying people places, but also sort of our community centers, right? That's where we interact all in one spot, and it's a limited space, but that's the challenge.
And so then, Emily, with your kind of view into the region, what are you seeing, I guess, that other areas might be doing, and what are some of the more exciting and compelling things that are happening right now?
Yeah, and I'll first say I'm one of those crazy ultramarathon runners, so I appreciate the space that you've created for me to train. I know exactly what you're talking about. But I think, yeah, I mean, as we were talking, I was thinking about, again, going back to a lot of this funding that's coming through the Inflation Reduction Act and specifically the climate pollution reduction grants. I mean, I think the main purpose of those is one, to plan for greenhouse gas reductions, and then second is that implementation phase, which was mentioned on the earlier panel, where there's even more money to actually implement these projects. And there's actually a grant going to that we will hope to award in the next week or so to Denver Regional Council of Governments, that will be getting a $1 million grant to do sort of the same idea as what Colorado as the state is doing, and develop its a sort of climate plan for this bigger region, which would include all the way up to Boulder and kind of around there. So, but part of that grant is to identify co-benefits of these projects. So while the main purpose of these projects that eventually could be funded for implementation is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, part of the evaluation and that kind of thing will be co-benefits, including resiliency. So I definitely see the tie between, like linking those two. It doesn't have to be seen as entirely two different things, mitigation versus adaptation. So I think that's kind of the direction we're going in, is, how can we kind of fund some of these projects like under a bigger umbrella?
And so when we're looking at co-benefits and we're probably seeking some of this funding, what are some of those things that really like are being honed in on, being looked at critically to like help improve your odds?
Well, I won't be making the decision,
Yeah.
so I can't totally say. I don't even know what the criteria is going to be. But I think a big piece actually is, which I should have mentioned earlier, is the benefit to low-income and disadvantaged communities. And I think that's, you can see that reflecting across a lot of agencies across the federal government, is, this emphasis on Justice 40 and kind of ensuring that, a lot of the benefits go to these, traditionally kind of communities that may have been left out of the conversation. And so, I think in terms of co-benefits, there's a big piece of it will be evaluating, specific benefits, and that goes for the climate pollution reduction grants, but also a lot of the other monies that are being awarded across the country. So I would say, benefits there, the resiliency benefits, workforce development benefits, that's another big piece, as we learned earlier on the panel, transitioning between energy economies, there's, workforce implications to that, and how do we bring those folks in terms of training, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different types of co-benefits, and I think, there's probably space to, there's some leeway to identify what those might be, as you're looking at different projects.
Certainly. Yeah, and I know there's no silver bullet, so that was a loaded question.
Yeah.
Dina, I saw you nodding. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you just said it, Emily. I think there's a lot of opportunity around equity. This is something that's really important to our communities. It's really important from leadership perspective, and we have started to develop frameworks that work really well so that we're always funding our equity communities first, essentially. And I'm really excited about the Dr. Cog-led climate action plan. We already have a climate action plan as a city, but one of the things we see is, like, in the city of Denver, we have what we call the inverted L, which is our lower income and vulnerable communities tend to be located in this sort of like geographically inverted L that sort of tags the I-25 and I-70 corridors, and people on the edges of the city. But a lot of our most vulnerable users, which of course come into Denver for work or use our resources, live in Aurora and use those same corridors that we're planning on. So how can we think about it as a region to address the needs of those communities first?
And I'm just going to zip back and forth. I think this is working quite well. So, in terms of, I guess, water and that bigger picture and equity, how are we, is this something that I'm not super knowledgeable on? So I am really interested on, what is the general water strategy in terms of equity in Denver?
There's a couple things I can touch on in the equity realm. So under the MOU, we had the goal of removing or replacing 30% of our turf grass, and quickly, as a signatory of that, we decided, like, we need to go above and beyond that and not say that it's just turf removal. And one of the areas that we're focusing on is how do we bring climate resilient landscapes to parts of the city that are underserved or disadvantaged. So what landscapes can work in these communities where you see a lot more kind of barren or just kind of fields of weeds right now, and how do we bring them back into the fold of having a landscape that works for them and also supports trees even with very minimal water input. And I think there are a couple city programs that help through the establishment period, but we're trying to build on those, and how can we pair that with rain gardens or other opportunities to bring stormwater onto site. And then Denver Water is also looking at, we've traditionally run conservation programs which kind of clean up the mess that has happened over many years, but how do we get what we want on the front end? And what we're trying to do right now is, through our system development charges, if we can get the most efficient fixtures and landscapes in new development, we'll actually provide money back on tap fees that way. And that's kind of a great thing. We tie it to the Denver Green Code, which is a voluntary code that's above and beyond the base building code. But through doing that, we can guarantee that we'll get more than 20% savings, and we only discount the taps by 20%. So it's a net value to us, and it's also a net value to the developer on the front end, and then the long-term residents that pay those rates over time.
That's really fascinating, and I'm just thinking about the water challenges of the parks and how dry a climate we do have, and we're talking about trees. I imagine there is some challenges there that need to be addressed in that collaboration.
Yeah, there's definitely conversations in parks of what do our native landscapes look like. So many of you know Colorado does not really have trees. Our trees only grow where there's water. So in our park spaces, we're trying not to pitch this either or, that there's either trees or there's native landscapes. We definitely need both. And the point is to put trees where people are. So along our trails and our streets and our picnic areas and our playgrounds, putting the trees in the right space and making sure we're irrigating those trees so that they survive and thrive. And our native landscapes, we can kind of create that separation where those are for habitat and wildlife, and people can use that as a viewing amenity and a passive recreation, and make sure we're creating those spaces that achieve both and balance both of those perspectives. I'll just quickly piggyback and say that Denver Parks also uses the equity index. So our index looks at park factors, and one of the things that index really drives is creating and acquiring new park land. So we're really looking at filling in the gaps so that every resident of Denver is within a 10-minute walk or roll to a park. So that's really helping us close the gaps of what are the connections to streets and getting people to walk from their house to a park in a safe and efficient manner that's shaded and has bike lanes or those other amenities. So really looking at how our system fits together.
And having gone to college in the city of Newark, New Jersey, which is fondly referred to as the Brick City, I really appreciate the idea that we need trees and things within 10 minutes of our place, because there are great parks in Newark. I love that city with my whole heart, but it's not quite the same as it is out here. And it's great. You can really feel the difference in some of these cities that do have expansive parks. And if you're not local to here, I do encourage you to visit any of our parks. They're wonderful. I spent quite a bit of time on even the Cherry Creek Reservoir on a stand-up paddleboard. And so as we're getting toward the end, I'm curious, if we look 5 years into the future, and we've done a lot of the work that we're doing now, we've hit some success, where are we going next? Anybody who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. I'd say we have a program in place that addresses both kind of residential needs for landscape conversions and also businesses, HOAs, and public space partners, and that can be anyone from city and county or school districts, urban gardens, things like that. And then the long term, a little bit past 5 years, we also need to study what these landscapes are doing to urban heat. Some of the hottest parts of our city are around DIA, which is largely native grass, but it's a very barren native grass compared to the landscapes that we're trying to put in. So we need to know kind of that feedback loop and make sure that these landscapes are working for us in a multi-benefit sort of way over the long term.
Is that paving the way for more agricultural type design of those spaces to get better outcomes than maybe what nature has given us in those areas?
I'm not sure that I'd go to full agriculture. I think that has a role, and what I really like about a lot of the agriculture community I've interacted with, they rely heavily on weather data, and I think we need to get better at installing more monitoring sites around urban centers as opposed to out in agricultural lands. I looked to Northern Water that runs a network of weather observation stations that are specific to evapotranspiration. So how much water is coming off the landscape evaporating, or how much the plants are using. And we don't have those same resources at a local urban level. And I think the microclimates in urban settings create such harsh extremes. There are certain pockets that are much wetter and certain pockets that are much drier. So we need to understand those a little better.
Very interesting. And then I guess looking then toward transportation, then we're getting, what it would be some of the best effects that we would see from getting better shade where we need it.
I'm going to harken back to your last question a little on this. 5 years is maybe too aggressive for
Maybe 20. Either way,
we'll see. But yeah, I think what I'd love to see happen is for every sort of some of these high points we've all talked about, that every project we work on, those things are already thought of and incorporated. And anytime we go to repave the street, we're thinking about, oh, can we use pervious paving? Of course we can. We've already looked up the recycled products that we need, and we're using 100%. Is there a space on the road for bicyclists? Like, of course it is. It's already integrated into the project. We reached out to the equity communities that are going to be most impacted by this road, and of course they're in the room right now talking to you. That's what I would love to see. That's difficult to incorporate into every single project that we do, but that's sort of the dream. And there are some cool, I don't think technology is the solution to everything, but there are some really cool technologies that can help us along. Like, speaking on the waterfront, we've also been looking at really hyper-localized weather prediction so that we can do a better job at response, and also when we go out and build our projects and keeping folks safe. And then I just learned about this, not that new, but like bioconcrete, which can not only is better at taking up like CO2, it's also self-healing, which is amazing. So there are things out there that I hope we're able to be open to using along the way.
How about you, Emily?
I guess I was just thinking, like, I think some of this funding could help toward that end, because it's giving folks money to plan. And so I know some people look at that and they're just like, oh, that's just money for planning. There's no like it's just a document. It's not like there's nothing on the ground, but I think some of the benefits are that you're building into the process like some of those elements, like bringing in traditionally communities that maybe weren't involved in the conversation, or thinking about impacts in a different way before just kind of slapping things on the ground. So I mean, I'm hopeful that kind of building that into the process will help. I mean, I guess what I would like to see as a federal agency is a little bit better communication across federal agencies. I think it's like super complicated for people that are looking for grants or applying for grants to it's just, especially right now, it's super overwhelming because there's just so much out there. And so when the timing is all different, every agency has different timing. Even with an EPA, the funding, is coming out in different chunks at different times. And so like keeping track of all that, and then just, we're starting that process. We've started what's called a Federal Climate Partners Group here in this region, so that EPA can talk to FEMA, can talk to NOAA, can talk to the other federal agencies on a more regular basis and kind of coordinate on these funding opportunities, because I think that has been a challenge. And, I would love to see like the federal, application process get a little bit more streamlined and easier. I don't know if that'll happen, but I mean, that would be a dream for me, just to make it a little bit simpler to apply.
We'll get there one day at a time.
Yeah, but my wish list.
Yeah. How about you, Jessica?
I would say the future I envision is nature-based solutions are our go-to starting point, that we bring all the partners to the table. But our best projects are not just parks leading a project. It's when we have 5 or 7 or 10 different project partners at the table, including people up here with me, along with the Mile High Flood District. Some of our best projects with the district incorporate, as you heard in the stormwater panel, those nature on top of the infrastructure. So creating spaces that people really care about and really building that ethic of stewardship. So we need our infrastructure to look like something people wants to see. So those park-like spaces, making sure people see that as infrastructure. And it doesn't really matter if they know that there's the big culvert underneath the park space. They see it as a park and they appreciate it.
And that gives me, I think, one question I think that we could wrap this up with, and it's a big topic that my company, we talk with a lot of people, is everything kind of change starts with culture. And getting a good culture at a company for whatever your initiatives are can tend to be challenging, but we found that a lot of it starts with a question you should start your day with, or a challenge that you should start a project with, to try and make sure that you're thinking differently, or making sure that your eye's on the ball. What are, if you were to choose, what would be the question that you should lead every project into with, or the thing that you would be having at your front of mind? And it can probably be 2 or 3 things if you didn't want to pick just one.
I'll jump in and say, as the Parks Department, it was recently quoted from one of our mayoral transition committees that Denver Parks and Recreation should be the most fun department in the city. So from that perspective, all of our projects should be, is it fun? Is it some place you would really want to be?
I love that, because if we're not enjoying what we're doing, what are we doing? So I think starting with what we care about is a great way to get people passionate about their work.
And we all care about our job so much. We're passionate about it. And we know that the community is very passionate about it too. They will tell us what they want to see. And the more we can listen to that and build that fun and making sure there's places they care about, that will drive our day.
Awesome. Austin?
I think I'm gonna say, who else can we bring in? And it makes for longer projects and messier projects, but the end result is often supported by so many more groups. Right now, on the landscape transformation side, everybody along the Front Range is trying to either stand up or increase the size of their programs. And we have no idea how to do that. We're running into supply chain issues on finding native plants in the nurseries, getting people to actually rip out the turf. Everybody wants that done May 1, and then interest tails off during the hottest part of the season, and then they want it right before we get into dormancy. So we need to figure out who all to bring in so that we can kind of weave this narrative and also get the right partners at the table that can take up some of that capacity when there's extra capacity, but also help us along and provide more on the native plants.
Awesome. Dana?
So when I first started doing this work, I remember talking to an older sort of like grizzled public works leader, and they said, we are the Department of Know, K-N-O-W, because we know so much. Our engineers are so good. We have a great deal of knowledge, but sometimes the public think we're the Department of Know, N-O, because we just say no to everything. And I feel like a tagline for some of us, we should be like, what don't we know? Like, what can we learn along the way? It's okay to fail up a little bit sometimes, as long as the bridge isn't going to fall down, right? But can we not be afraid to learn something along the way and not just use what we've used before?
That's really good, and mine's a little similar. I was in a conversation with a colleague of mine at EPA. She said, a lot of times we get used to in the federal government is just being like, well, if it's not like in your purview, then you just say, well, it's not me. Like, I don't know, but like you really should say, like, it's not me, but I will help you find out who can help you. So it's like basically don't say no is kind of the bottom line. So it's customer service basically. Like we're here to.
No, I think that's fantastic, and I know we're a little bit over. I really appreciate all your responses, and I think if anybody could take anything to heart, it's all those answers. Because enjoying what you do, knowing that you can't possibly know everything, get as much help as you can, and like we do this better together. That's how we're going to change. And so, thank you so much for this conversation today, and thank you everybody for sticking around with us. And thank you to Ken. And we'll get to the fun part: who's going to win an iPad? So.